So, good morning, pre-service teachers. How are you today? Fine? Okay, great. Now, are you ready to listen to our today's discussion? So, our topic for today is all about learners with hearing impairment and with visual impairment. So, because you are now a pre-service teachers, you have to know how to identify, how to handle, and how to motivate learners with hearing impairment and with visual impairment. Learners with visual impairment, you can observe that they have physical signs such as crossed eyes, squinting, and eyes that turns upward. And because they have difficulty seeing, they may be clumsy and usually bumping into objects. Since they have visual impairment, they like to sit near the instructional materials, especially for those students who are nearsighted. It can also be observed by their reading skills and their writing skills. So that's those skills may be usually they have poor performances in those skills. Now that you know how to identify learners with visual impairment, let's move on how to handle these learners. Please listen carefully because as a pre-service teachers, you should know these things. To handle learners with visual impairment, modification in teaching is very significant. So let's start. Any types of books is commonly used by teachers. And of course, for learners with visual impairment, it's hard for them to use books. So as a teacher, for these kinds of learners, you have to inform them ahead of time so that they can order in braille or in an audio recorded format. And for those who have no resources or who cannot afford to order in braille, and as a teacher, you should prepare your own audio materials or your recorded materials to be provided by you for your learners. And you may be the one to read loudly the text and your visual aids so that all can hear your discussion. And we also use instructional materials that are tactile so that learners with visual impairment can use their sense of touch instead of just plain pictures and text. And when you become a teacher and encounter learners with visual impairment, see to it that they are sitting near the instructional materials or nearer you where you are discussing so that you can easily assist them whenever they have problems, especially in terms of their learning process. And also you can assign a buddy to help them for their mobility. You should be careful with your terminologies that you are going to use to your students. For example, like this one. Class create visual materials like this one. How can they create like this one if they have no sense of sight or they have difficulty in seeing? So, please use words that are appropriate for students with visual impairment. And lastly, as a teacher, you are responsible to monitor always all your students, not just for those learners with visual impairment. All your students because you are in inclusive classroom. And the last, how to motivate these learners. So how to motivate learners with visual impairment? You can motivate them to boost their self-confidence by by cheering them up, but don't pressure them. And also, you should always appreciate what they have done. For example, congrats, you did it, good job. That simple words will help them to excel more in class, to listen more in your discussion. And always say, hi, hello, how are you? That again motivates them to enter your classroom, to go to school every day. And as a teacher, you should always observe your students and you should help them whenever they have problems. So let's move on to students or to learners with hearing impairment. Learners with hearing impairment refers to students with an issue regarding hearing that affects their educational performances. But hearing impairment is different to deafness. Deafness is considered when hearing loss is above 90 decibels, while hearing impairment is considered when hearing loss is below 90 decibels. Since hearing is important to hear the one speaking and is important to gather information, the main challenge here in the struggle of students with hearing impairment is communication. Am I right? Yes, communication. And we all knew that communication is very significant to our everyday lives, and this includes the teaching learning process. So, how to identify learners with hearing impairment? You can observe to your students that they usually speak loudly and they position their ear toward the direction of the one speaking or toward the direction of the sound. So, when the other side of their ear is still functioning, then that side will be positioned toward the direction of the one speaking or toward the direction of the sound. And also, hearing learners with hearing impairment possibly ask for information to be repeated twice, thrice, or more than 4 times until they can get it because of course they have difficulty hearing it. If someone asks something to them, they don't have the response immediately because they have difficulty hearing it. And as a teacher, when you are discussing something in front of your class, usually learners with hearing impairment are facing you intently or looking at you intently so that they can focus on your utterances. And as a teacher, you have to clearly emphasize what you say. And also, you can observe learners with hearing impairment, they need directions to be repeated many times. Now let's move on how to handle learners with hearing impairment. To handle them, as a teacher, you should help your students develop their speech reading ability or reading others' lips, mouth, and expressions. For the learners with hearing impairment, to read your lips and expressions enable them to focus on your utterances. And as a teacher, you should always face all your students so that it is advantage for learners with hearing impairment so that they can catch your discussion by reading your mouth, your lips, your expressions while discussing. And then, the exaggeration of word pronunciation. That would be difficult for learners with hearing impairment. So you should avoid the exaggeration of words pronunciation because it will be more confusing for learners with hearing impairment. And then, because they have difficulty in hearing, written materials and visuals are more appropriate for them to be utilized. And also, it can also be appropriate for all your students when you are in inclusive classroom or in mainstream classroom. And then lastly, patient. Patient is very important to handle learners, all learners, normal students, or with visual or with hearing impairment. Patience is very important to be possessed by a teacher. Okay, so now let's proceed on how to motivate learners with hearing impairment. So how to motivate them? You can motivate them by cheering them up when let them answer something. Always appreciate what they have done. A simple, good job, very good. That will help them to be motivated to learn more in your class. And then engage them in different activities with their classmates. We are finished with our discussion on how to identify, how to handle, and how to motivate learners with hearing impairment and with visual impairment. I hope you have learned something from our discussion. That's all, and thank you for listening. Bye!